What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the You Know Ball podcast. And today I'm very excited to do something a little bit different. It's All-Star weekend. We don't really have much going on. I don't really want to talk about the disaster of a dunk contest that happened last night. Everything about the All-Star weekend kind of bores me. So we're going to do something special today. And we're going to do a collaboration with Chuck from Chucking Darts, which is an NBA draft podcast. And we are going to go back and revisit the 2013 draft, which Sixers fans know as the first process draft. Most NBA fans know as the Giannis draft. So, Chuck, what's going on?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on, man. We've been talking for a while about trying to do some sort of draft crossover, and this is your baby, this idea, and I couldn't love it more because in addition to being the Giannis draft and the process draft, 2013 in the moment was known as the worst draft in like 10 years. And that's how, and even in retrospect, that's what people kind of say about it. And I think frequently when that's the label something gets, someone's missing something. You really have to remember how far the NBA has come in terms of talent. And to go back and dig into this, I think is a really valuable and fun thing to do.
Yeah, it's weird because usually going into a draft, it feels like the only other time that we've had this recently was the 2020 draft, where like we went into it and we were like, this is not a good draft. And the large majority of drafts are judged by the talent at the top and like the surefire hits. And going into 2013, and actually similarly to 2020, even though we can now say the top two of the top three picks are clear multi-time all-stars in the future, going into the draft, it seemed like this consensus that the draft wasn't as strong made shit just really weird and all over the place. People had different evaluations of players. People didn't really have more of a consensus at the time about the talent. And obviously, when we go back towards the end of this episode and we redraft the lottery, you'll see that like the players that were selected that are the best talent from this draft were like pretty much nowhere near the top of the draft. And it feels like very strange to look back, especially when you consider who the number one pick was in this draft, who was selected towards the top of the draft, that this was like, obviously going into it, people were shitting all over the talent that was in it. But like, I can't think of a draft where like the two best players were in the middle of the first round and the end of the first round, like just off the top of my head.
And it's those kinds of drafts are like chum in the water for me because like I do draft stuff all the time. In my podcast, I try to cover both the league and the draft, but my heart really kind of lies with the draft. And if there's a draft where it's just so, so obvious, quote unquote, about who the top player is or who the top players are, then that's not as fun for me. I like when opinions diverge and when everyone starts like panicking about who's good and who isn't. Number one, what they usually say is there's a drop off. They mistake confusion for a lack of quality. And that zone is where I like to evaluate because it means that doesn't usually mean that there's a huge drop off. I mean, it can, but what it basically means is that consensus orthodox thinking sort of fails, and you have to dig a little bit deeper to find out where the values are, where the good players are. In 2013 and 2020, which I love that you mentioned that one, are like the shining examples of that. Because even now, if you look back at 2020 and you go, well, they had LaMelo and Ant, Halliburton, Bane, who knows if Wiseman will turn into something. Patrick Williams was my guy in that draft. Like, there's real talent at the top of that draft. And 2013 is the same way. And for the guys to go where they went, the best players in this draft, speaks a lot to where NBA thinking was at the time, who was making mistakes and why, and what we can learn from them. So I could not be more excited to dig in.
Yeah. So like you said, let's talk a little bit just about like the pre-draft thoughts that were going around. So this kind of consensus or lack of consensus, I guess I should say, because it didn't really seem like, if you looked at Chad Ford's big board or you looked at Jay Billis's big board, like Jay Billis had Ben McLemore #1 overall
Yeah.
as his
Yeah.
and like Jay Billis is like, he's not like the greatest draft guy, but at the time there wasn't this massive network of draft Twitter and podcasts and blogs that were like covering the draft religiously. So Jay was one of the more reliable people that you could go to. Chad Ford from ESPN was another guy, even though, he has a history of now going back and changing what was on his board. We actually went and listened to some old podcasts. When you look at the top of his board, there were a few guys that were being discussed as like the potential #1 overall pick.
Mhm.
The main guy that seemingly was the closest to consensus was actually Nerlens Noel, which is really funny in retrospect. The player that the Sixers got in this draft was the consensus #1 overall pick. Makes a lot of sense. It was the first Sam Hinkie draft. He swings the trade for Drew Holiday, and Nerlens was thought to be #1 pretty much for a good chunk of the draft process, and then he has the injury. So he tore his ACL, I believe.
Yes.
I can't. He tore his ACL, and they talked about it on the pre-draft podcast. So me and you both actually went back and we consumed some content from that era. So of course we went back and we listened to Bill Simmons. At the time it was the BS Report. He did 2 episodes with Chad Ford before the draft and after the draft. And they talked about Nerlens, and it's funny, like seeing what Nerlens has become. And he's like a solid NBA player, like maybe a fringe starter / high-end backup center that is a decent, valuable player. But at the same time, like the #1 overall pick seems like insane to me in retrospect.
Yes. And to start, to be clear, Nerlens ended up going 6th in this draft. So though he had the pre-draft hype, like when push came to shove, people found reasons not to take him. And I think a lot of it had to do with that injury. But this, remember, this was like the height of one and done Kentucky like propaganda. And propaganda is not the best word because a lot of those guys were good. John Wall had gone #1 overall a few years before. Anthony Davis, I think, had gone #1 overall a couple years before. And
I think it was literally the year before. It was 2012.
Yeah, I mix up him and the Kyrie year.
But that's like that just shows you 2 of 3 years before this draft was #1 Kentucky guys. But Nerlens wasn't close to the level of prospect as those guys coming out.
Exactly. And because there wasn't, what this draft lacked was a blue chip offensive one and done American player. That's what threw everyone into a frenzy about what are we going to do at the top of this draft, because in the absence of like a freshman stud offensive force, which, Anthony Davis is a two-way force, but he was a great offensive player at Kentucky.
Yeah, of course.
That's when people started to reach for whatever sort of narrative momentum kind of made sense to them. And because Nerlens was good, he was a good college player, and he was a freshman, he was at Kentucky, then the momentum started to build around him as sort of like a default selection. And we can talk about his like profile as a prospect. But his two biggest, I guess, red flags, you would say, or issues with his game were, #1, that he had just hurt his knee, and he wasn't, though he was very agile, very quick, and like an explosive jumper, he wasn't very big for his position. He's skinny. And if you have knee problems and you're skinny for your position, then you have to be very, very skilled. And though Nerlens was very skilled on defense, like he couldn't shoot. So by modern standards, that's the biggest issue. Skinny for position, injured, and couldn't shoot. And I think the injury probably is what dropped him. But in terms of what I think we know now versus then, or what people should have known then, is that if you're that challenged offensively as a big, you shouldn't go #1 overall. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
You shouldn't.
And I think in a draft class with a bunch of flawed prospects, it seemed like while Nerlens was like, as you said, this default number one. Basically, we don't have anybody else, so you get to be the guy. He fits a lot of the narratives. He showed flashes at Kentucky that would say, oh, he has a ton of promising upside. He had the length and athleticism and all that stuff and blah, 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 blah. The other guy that I don't know at the time if it was consensus, but it's someone that Bill Simmons and Chad Ford were calling like the sure thing was Victor Oladipo.
Right.
And that makes a lot more sense to me in retrospect, because if you think about what the league values, two-way wing, guy who is pretty much seemed like a sure thing, but also had upside. I don't know if you caught this, but in the episode with Bill Simmons and Chad Ford said he thought Victor Oladipo had more upside than Kawhi Leonard.
Yeah.
And Kawhi at the time wasn't like a superstar yet. He wasn't even an all-star, but he had just been in the NBA Finals, I believe, and played very good defense on LeBron James. If I'm remembering correctly, 2013 was that like kind of his breakout in the finals, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, no, his he was like definitely a blue chipper in the NBA by that point. I can't remember if the hype really surrounded him then or the next year when he wins Finals MVP as like a puppy.
Right,
But
that was like the real like Kawhi has arrived. He's a clear star, but like the signs were there from his first few seasons. He plays great defense on LeBron in the finals. He's a key rotation player on a finals team. And it's just funny to me because Chad Ford brings it up in his thing. It was the consensus that like there is no number one. And it's like, but you're talking about Victor Oladipo like he's this sure thing. He's seemingly a two-way wing who you already know is going to be really good defensively. And he has more upside than one of the best prospects in the NBA at the time. So like, how is this guy not number one? I think he was number one on Bill and Chad's board at the time, to give them credit. Like Bill weirdly, like Bill gets a lot of shit for a lot of things, including from me. And like, I make fun of him all the time, but he like kind of weirdly, and he covered the draft. He was on the show. He kind of weirdly nailed this draft.
Yeah, I think he did decently. Like in terms of, especially like, it's one thing to have your own board and do this in your own time. But if you're going to be on TV and covering the draft, like in the moment and everything like that, number one, if you're on national TV, you're not going to want to like kill any of these young kids whose like dreams are coming true before your eyes. So you have to like sell kind of everyone. But he liked Oladipo, and Oladipo, I mean, we'll get to it when we do the redraft, but in terms of like traditional metrics and traditional thinking, I think that is the right consensus number one thing. The reason that he wasn't consensus, and by anyone who, you mentioned it before, but if there's anyone who this draft reflects on terribly, it's Billis. His board was awful, and he had Oladipo 6th. Oof. And in the draft, if you have ranked 6th, the guy who ends up the second or third best player in the draft, that doesn't seem like a big gulf, but that is like massive. That is, you get fired as a GM within 12 months if that's your evaluation.
And that was my thought on that was Bill Simmons did better than some NBA GMs in this draft. Like just to put it in perspective, and like maybe it's a little bit of low hanging fruit because a lot of the guys that did well from this draft are like guys that Bill tends to go for, like the sure thing type guys. Like he kept like 2 of his guys in this draft were Depot and CJ McCollum. And those guys, like maybe they don't have this like absolutely massive upside, although Chad Ford thought a higher upside than Kawhi Leonard. So maybe he did, but the idea behind those guys, they seem more of sure things and like having a bias towards maybe older players. I think Depot had been there for 2 years. He was not a one and done, I believe. And
2 or 3.
Yeah, 2 or 3. And then CJ McCollum was a 3-year guy. He was an upperclassman at Lehigh and blah, blah, blah. It feels like you have a larger sample size to work with. He also sat down with the prospects, which was like, they talked a lot about like the off the court stuff. So like off the court, Depot and CJ McCollum came across as like really good dudes that like you could trust and like you would want on your team. And that seems to be like in a weird draft where like there isn't a consensus like blow you away talent guy, maybe you should factor in some of that stuff more. Like he works hard. He put like, I know you didn't even mention Tyrese Maxey in the 2020 draft, which personally hurt me. But I will say, like, I always talk about like when you get towards like the middle of the first, the end of the first round, like just draft good basketball players. And if they're great guys off the court and hard workers off the court, total bonus. Like take the sure thing in, but then again, I guess that kind of goes against what I said earlier, because it's like, if you took the sure thing in this draft, you miss on Giannis and Gobert, who go 15 and 27. So it's like, it's kind of like having a draft strategy that is like almost monolithic is like not good. Like you should just be open to like whatever the board breaks in your direction, essentially.
Yeah. So we're recording this where we can see each other's screens, and I can see the draft gleam in your eye forming when you realize you can't have just one philosophy. It has to change pick to pick, team to team, player to player, type to type.
It does.
That's why it's so addicting, man. But yeah, I think that one commonality you get with a lot of guys at the top of this draft is that, like I mentioned before, they weren't one and dones. You know, Nerlens was, but Otto Porter was at Georgetown for multiple years. Alex Len, who went near the top of this draft multiple years. Cody Zeller, same thing. Depot, same thing. CJ McCollum, same thing. And so when you have so many multi-year guys, which in the modern age is not, it's certainly not like a death sentence, but you want someone who's immediately good in college as a freshman. That's what makes jobs easier. In the absence of that, that's where opinions can like really, really diverge. And depending on when you look at a guy like Oladipo, maybe Billis watched him more when he was his first year at Indiana, where he was like super raw. And then you go from year one to year two, and going into year two, maybe you have Victor Oladipo as like 30th on your board. And so that's a bias that you have to overcome over the course of the year. But then you want to say, well, I don't want to be completely swayed by how he played at the end of the season. Then that's a small sample bias. It's all this like, it's all just mental gymnastics that you have to do. But
yeah,
like
absolutely.
a player this year who's like that is sort of like Johnny Davis in Wisconsin, because this year's draft is, I won't go on too big of a tangent here, but it's similar in that after the first couple picks, like opinions diverge wildly. And Davis is a guy who's going to be a first-team All-American this year. And I think Oladipo was right around there for Indiana. But it's like a massive jump. And the positive, I think the right way to view it, and what Simmons did, and I guess Ford did, and Billis kind of didn't do, is valuing improvement. And that factors in that off-court stuff, that interview stuff. If a player is good enough to like measurably get better at the things they weren't good at, and in Oladipo's case, it was shooting. He was not a good shooter his first year at Indiana, wasn't a great ball handler either. And then the year before he gets drafted, he shoots over 40% from three. He just works and works and works and works. That gives you confidence that once they get into the NBA, they are going to get a lot better. And that's really the key, at least to me, is that you have to invest in players who are going to get better in the league, because every great player in the NBA has gotten a lot better since they first got into the NBA. And that's sort of like what you have to keep in mind with any top pick. That is the one thing that translates across any pick, any team, any player. You have to bank on improvement. And so if you have someone who's gotten so much better like Oladipo, it doesn't surprise me that his off the court stuff was excellent and that he was like great in a room, because you have to be self-motivated to get better. You have to be self-aware to get better. You have to know what to work on, not just work hard, but work smart. All that stuff factors in. And that's why I think Oladipo was, I mean, he went number 2, and that's why I think he should have gone right up there. That's what makes so much sense to me with him. And McCollum, the same thing.
And it makes a lot of sense that he would want to go to the pull yourself up by your bootstraps team in Miami to be part of that culture now, because he seems like he kind of buys into that kind of narrative, at least, and like wants to be around people that are similar minded to him in that sense. But the thing that you were saying, so like towards the top of the draft, we get to the draft and like no one really knows. Like I kind of miss the time when no one knew who the number 1 overall pick was going to be. Like I can't remember a draft recently where we went into it and we were like, well, we think it's going to be this guy, but it might be that guy. Like last year was probably the closest we've got to that, where we were like, I don't really know, but like a few days before it seemed like, no, Anthony Edwards is definitely going to be the number 1 overall pick, and we don't have to worry about it like going into the draft. This draft, even Bill Simmons on the broadcast was like, whoa, Anthony Bennett, number 1 overall. And like, of course you hear rumors and stuff, but it seems like in this age of like Woj and Shams and like draft obsessiveness and like podcasts and like the whole, just everything surrounding the draft, it makes it impossible to be like, here's our guy that we're going to take and not get that out into the world. Like going, like, for example, I keep bringing up the 2020 draft, but like we knew the top 4 picks in the 2020 draft, like before the draft even started. It felt like we were like, we knew Edwards was going to go 1. We knew Wiseman was going to go 2. From there, we were pretty sure that LaMelo was going to go 3. And then we were like, and then 4, Patrick Williams was like the late riser. He was kind of the first surprise, but like there was a lot of rumors and whispers around that. But like during this draft, to have someone like Anthony Bennett go number 1 overall is insane. It's not even like one of those things where you look back and like we keep talking about like hindsight bias and like retrospect, and like we could look back and be like, oh, how did this team not take that guy and blah 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 blah. Everyone was like, why are they taking Anthony Bennett at number 1 overall? Like it was like a shock at the time and has proven to be right by history.
Yeah, it's a great point, and you're right. I mean, it's Woj and Shams and social media. Like the fact that those guys are as plugged in and as influential as they are now, like not all developments are like good evolutionary developments. That like they just do that because they can, and it's more engagement for them and for their companies. But that doesn't make the experience of actually watching the draft any more fun. Now, it is a lot of fun for people to follow those guys and to like look for Woj bombs and breaking news and everything. And that's great, but you have to be
dopamine hits, get the serotonin flowing.
That's exactly right. You have to be kind of a sicko to do that. And we both are.
Yeah, we are.
So it's great for us, but for like the draft and the NBA, I mean, even now the NBA is still looking for ways to like be more popular. If you watch that dunk contest last night, it was an atrocity. And like they need to try to get more people invested and interested in the product. And for the neutral watcher or the neutral possible watcher, Woj is not good, because if you watch the draft, the drama's taken out of it. You know, so that's more the thing. Like I agree.
He's not spoiling the picks. He's saying that they're locked in. He's saying that they're thinking in theory, they're dreaming of. It's always just like these vague terms, and we're like, Woj, we know what you're doing, dude. You're ruining the pick for everyone, which is fine. I have my notification set up so that you can ruin the pick for me in advance, and I can get 30 seconds before everyone else, I can get my little serotonin slop hit. And I respect you for that. But at the same time, I totally agree. It's like, it does feel like the transaction element of the NBA is more. I can tell you based on the draft episodes I've done, based on the free agency episodes I've done, the trade episodes, that definitely seems to be the thing that people care the most about, which is fine. But as a whole, like there was something about like even the NFL draft has gotten to the point where like it's hard to go into it and not know who the number 1 overall pick was. But like maybe I'm being a little bit nostalgic right now, but like I do remember going into drafts and being like, we had no idea who was going to go number 1. And there was a level of excitement around that like, you're not going to get a Bill Simmons screaming whoa on television at the 2022 draft, because we're probably going to know by the week of the draft, like, you know, it might come down to like Chet Holmgren or Paulo Banchero or one of the guys towards the top of the draft, but we'll probably have a good idea of who's going to go number 1 overall by the time that comes around. That's just something that like I kind of miss. But just before we actually get into the like what happened at the draft, just another few notes I had here. So Bill's guys heading into the draft, and I talked about like how he was kind of more on point with this draft. He had the guys that he constantly talked about were he brought up CJ McCollum. He liked CJ. He thought CJ he kept comparing him to Jason Terry, felt like he was a sure thing because of on the court, off the court, everything, blah, blah, blah. He also liked Trey Burke, which I totally understand because as a hooper and as someone who loves bucket getters, and also it was something you talked about earlier. It's like this March Madness thing, and Chad Ford brought it up, like getting caught up with guys who kind of have like a run in them at March Madness. Trey Burke went from like a late first round pick to like a top 10 guy by the draft, to the point where like people were talking about him towards the top of the draft because of the run that he had, which, you know, it tends to not have great results based on the history of guys that he talked about. And then the other guys that he liked, he did mention Giannis in passing, and he was like, I like that guy. Like he basically every time it seems like with Giannis and this draft, like going into the draft, it seemed like people had this idea of him as like the upside swing. Like he was the, like, even when, and not to spoil what happened at the draft, but like even during the Giannis pick, the idea of Giannis was this like massive upside dude, because they did a segment after he was drafted called Unlimited Potential, and it was like sponsored by AT&T and shit. And like the idea of Giannis becoming one of the 50 greatest players, well, higher than that, greatest players of all time, was not even like a thought. Like Chad Ford said, there are no superstars in this draft, there are no guaranteed all-stars, blah 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 blah. But like going into the draft, it seemed like people were kind of like, this, if you're going to take an upside swing, take the upside swing on this guy. So it wasn't like there was like not just like completely zero knowledge on this potential.
Yeah. So do you want to like do the Giannis convo now?
So we can talk, we can do the Giannis combo now, because we're about to get into the actual draft itself.
Okay.
And I just want to say one more thing that I had on here, which was before the draft, Chad Ford said he would not trade the third pick for Jimmy Butler.
Yes. Oh, I love that you had it. I was going to bring it up if you didn't. Yeah.
That was the other one that I was like, a lot of Chad Ford's takes from this draft aged like milk. But once again, when you have first off, generally speaking, top picks do not get traded for players.
That's right.
Top 5 picks, because it's just too much of it's funny enough, it's probably a safer bet a lot of the times. Like if you were to have traded the third pick for Jimmy Butler in this draft, it's a fucking home run. But at the time, you know, it's like, it's thought to be risky to be like, we're going to trade, like we have a top 3 pick and we're going to trade it for Jimmy Butler and blah, blah, blah. But that was the only other thing that I thought really stood out about this pre-draft podcast, this pre-draft process, that was shocking to me, was like, Jimmy Butler, who I believe was going into his third season at the time. Yeah. And he would have been a little bit older, like, and he hadn't really fully broken out yet, but like the consensus around him wasn't even like, I would trade the pick that became Otto Porter Jr. for him.
Yeah. And Simmons agreed with him, by the way. He's also like, yeah, I wouldn't do it for Jimmy Butler, but like, okay. So I love that you brought this up about the risk of trading picks. This is something I talk about on my show, that I've talked about repeatedly. And if you have a pick, you have a top pick, and someone's like, well, I want to do a 1-for-1 trade for this player for that pick. Most of the time, the player that they're going to offer is like not yet an all-star, because that would make them such a proven commodity. They would want more than just your pick. So as the owner of the pick, you're like, well, this guy's not an all-star, and we have the top pick. We're so good at drafting this. I kept saying this about the Warriors, both of these last 2 years.
Yes. Perfect example.
They were not going to trade the number 2 pick that they used on Wiseman for anything that they thought was fair value, because in their minds, they're going to nail the pick. They're so optimistic about their own ability to draft that settling for anything other than a franchise player would seem to be like giving up the goose. On the other hand, if you have a good player and someone's like, well, we'll trade you the number 5 pick for Jimmy Butler or whatever. The the team that has the player is going to go, well, we're not just going to trade him for just one pick. That pick could bust.
Yep.
It's such an interesting psychological switch depending on which asset you have. In one case, you're very pessimistic about the outcome of the pick and losing your commodity. On the other side, you're so optimistic about the outcome of the pick that you turn down the commodity. And that is like, if you look for modern inefficiencies in the NBA, like transactionally, how teams get better, that is a huge one, in my opinion, is understanding the likely value of a given draft slot and how aggressive teams should be in trading. And that's something that Daryl Morey has brought up. And he said it mostly about like late first round picks.
For sure.
The teams should be much more aggressive in trading them because they don't turn into much. But like 8th overall picks end up usually, if they're good, being like starters. So if you get a starter right now for the 8th overall pick, who's maybe at the end of his rookie deal and now he's going to enter his prime, that becomes much more affordable than waiting out the growing pains of a young player who's only ever going to ascend to solid starter as opposed to all-star.
Yeah, I think he did it with Shane Battier a few years before this when he was in Houston. A perfect example in this draft was he traded the pick that in the James Harden deal that they got from Toronto for Kyle Lowry, and the pick ended up becoming lower than they even expected to. It was like 13, and OKC ended up taking Steven Adams, who's had a good career, but like Morey took the sure thing in James Harden, who we were like, we know James Harden is good right now, and he might even have more potential. So it's the perfect example of that. And then it just, I think about like recent drafts, and it doesn't seem like anyone ever does that anymore.
No one does.
No one ever like really, this is funny enough. This is the last time that I can think of a team, like multiple teams doing that. And the two guys that did it in this draft were Morey, who traded the Toronto pick for Harden, and the Drew Holiday trade that we will talk about, which is they took 6 and their 2014 pick, and we traded Drew Holiday to the Pelicans. But we can get into Giannis now, because obviously in any normal redraft, there's no question Giannis, multiple time MVP, he just won finals MVP. He's the clear number one in this draft. So like I said before, the potential for him was somewhat known. Now, once again, no one thought he was going to be what he became, but like, it's not like this complete question mark to the point where like people weren't at least tantalizing about thinking about this tantalizing upside and like this idea of what Giannis could become, because we had like Bill Simmons joke, like, I watched some footage of him in a gym going against CYO teams. But he looked good to me. But like, also he looked good to me, but like, what is the competition that he's going up against? The major question marks with him were like, who his competition was. He was so raw. He was so young. And also he wasn't even the size that he became. Like, he grew after he got to the NBA to be as tall as he is now. So like, I don't really remember anything being talked about Giannis at the time of this draft. Like, I honestly, going back and rewatching it and hearing them talk about him pre-draft, and then and like they call him the Greek kid like a lot.
Yeah.
Like, he didn't even, like, it wasn't even like Giannis or like anything like that. It was like the Greek kid. Like, do you remember anything about Giannis around the time of this draft? Like, because I literally don't remember a single thing.
I remember basically what you said. The whole thing about Giannis at the time was that he was mysterious, and it was very rare, even among European prospects, to get a European prospect from a league as bad as the one that Giannis was in. Because he was in Europe, this won't be a big tangent. You have the Euroleague. The Euroleague is like the Champions League in soccer. It is a collection of the best teams from all of the domestic leagues. And if you're a really good young player playing in a pro league, chances are you're going to like not be the best player on your team, and you're going to be a role player. So you can find guys who are good and just haven't been given the minutes on teams that don't even make the Euroleague. They're just stuck in their own domestic league. And so like Giannis, Greece is not known as a basketball hotbed, certainly wasn't at the time. and his team didn't make it to the Euroleague. And so that, at the time there was much more bias towards European players, I think, or like against European players. I think there's still a bias towards European players to a certain extent.
I mean,
and
dude, even as recent as 2018, like
yeah,
there's no reason why Luka shouldn't have been the number 1 overall pick.
absolutely. Yeah, totally. And so and Luka, like by comparison, was in a very prestigious Spanish league, won Euroleague MVP with all these other grown ass men at 18 years old. So he was about as sure thing as it gets. But the reason that Giannis didn't get talked about, the other reason that he didn't get talked about much at the top, was that like frankly, and I'm not saying this is indefensible. Like I think it's defensible. GM just didn't have the balls to pick him. Like if you're a GM and you have an owner that wants you to be good or make a really good pick, you have to be able to sell that owner on your selection, or else the owner's just going to fire you. And if a big part of your pitch with Giannis is like, well, it's a mystery box. A mystery box could be anything. It could even be a boat. That is not going to be a compelling enough pitch to your owner. So in order to be sure about a guy like Giannis, you need to do so much intel and so much work to be able to craft sort of a vision that you can sell to your owner. And I think, frankly, most teams in the NBA, they care about the draft, but they don't invest the resources in it to be able to see, at least at the time. They didn't invest the amount of resources to be able to be truly confident about a guy like Giannis. They might send a scout or two overseas, but they don't really pour their stuff into figuring that kind of thing out. It's another modern inefficiency, frankly. And if you look at something Simmons said, this wasn't about Giannis, this was about Oladipo at the time of the draft, which is an old school way of thinking, but a good one that I think absolutely has merit. He's like, well, I just watched the finals and I'm trying to envision which players can play in the finals. And he starts listing these qualities of Oladipo. He's athletic, cares so much about the game, like plays on offense and defense, improves, busts his ass, all of which is fair. The reason Giannis should have gone higher, even given his mystery, the pitch that GMs should have made more successfully to their owners, is that this is 2013, right? Heat and Spurs are in the finals. We're in the peak of like the Heatles thing. So the best players in the league are LeBron and Kevin Durant. And in that finals, Kawhi sort of announces himself as a guy who's going to be relevant for a long time. So they're all very, very athletic wings, right? And Giannis, the thing that stuck out to him relative to everyone else in the draft is that there was not a more athletic kid at his size. And he grew, but he was still 6'9" at time of the draft,
right?
Who had some offensive skill, because even in this league, he was handling the ball. He was pushing in transition. He was making dump off passes at the rim, dunking on everyone.
Called him the Greek Paul George.
Exactly. So if you have that wing player who looks like he can do something and the athleticism is there, then you at the very least have someone who could potentially guard the best players in the world. It's not saying he's going to be LeBron, but maybe he can check LeBron. And that is almost as hard to find as LeBron himself. That's why teams should have been more aggressive on taking Giannis in the top 10, even given the lack of info.
It's weird because the 3 GMs that passed on him that make no sense to me. Okay, so the one I can, it makes a little bit of sense to me. The one being Presti because of the team that he had at the time. So just generally speaking about what Sam Presti liked in prospects at the time, like he loved athletic guys. He tended to draft guys who couldn't shoot. He was like, we're going to mold them into what they can become as players, as opposed to drafting guys who are finished products. So he picked a few before they take Steven Adams. Okay, well, you have Kevin Durant. You had just been to the NBA Finals not too long ago. Like, maybe you don't want to take that upside swing. Maybe you want to take more of a guy who can just be kind of like a role player on your team. So you take Steven Adams. Okay, that's a little bit justifiable to me.
Keep going.
I'm still skeptical, but like I can see the logic behind the pick a little bit more, especially because the Steven Adams pick, all things considered, turned out pretty good for where he went.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that element of it. But then the two GMs that make literally no sense to me, that like obvious one is Sam Hinkie. Is like, how are you taking, like, your whole thing was, we're going to take upside swings. We're going to take like raw guys and we're going to build them into this. We're going to be bad so that we can have a high pick in the next draft. We don't want win now guys. We want guys who could potentially be the best players in 5 years from now. And this was the beginning of the stockpiling of the assets. He had just traded Drew Holiday, so he had 2 picks before Giannis. He takes Nerlens because he falls, which I agree with that logic. Like, it makes sense. He takes Nerlens at 6, and then he ends up taking Michael Carter-Williams with the 2nd pick, which, like, at the time, he was thought to have a little bit of upside and blah, 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 and, like, he also couldn't shoot and da-da-da. Yeah. But, like, to me, Hinkie seems like the guy that most would have been likely to take Giannis and take that upside swing and not really worry about the present and think about into the future, because he's thinking the 2014 draft, I want to have a high pick again. I'm going to have multiple shots at that, including my own pick, and we're going to be bad. So I should just take the guy that I think could become a true, like, all-star caliber player. Okay, so there's that. And then the last one is Danny Ainge with the Boston Celtics, because at this draft, so first off, you just talked about like putting resources into the draft and like sending scouts and blah, blah, blah. Danny Ainge himself flew over. And by the way, of course, this leaks after the draft, after Giannis becomes Giannis.
Yeah. Classic Danny.
Classic Danny Ainge.
We were so like, close.
We almost got to, like, he did it, and he did it with lesser players too. He did it with Tyler Hero, and he did it with like guys who basically, after they become really good, he's like, we almost drafted them. We almost, like, all the stories always get out there. And he did it with Giannis. At the time, he had flown over and watched him play for this like nothing league. And the reason why it doesn't make any sense to me that he didn't take that swing on Giannis, which was, I believe, the pick before they took Kelly Olynyk, and who is a fine player, but like, obviously, if you're going for upside, Giannis was the guy. And the reason it didn't make any sense to me that they didn't take him was because of the trade that they made that night, because they traded away Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce. Like, they were in full rebuild mode from that night on. And like, they had gotten all these draft picks in the future and all of that. And it's like, those are the 3 GMs where I look back and I go, how did not one of those 3, considering the circumstances, considering the guys that they tend to go for, and considering the fact that, like, even at the time we thought of Giannis as this upside swing, not even take a chance on him?
Yeah, you are so good at these topics, man. You are crushing it in this episode. So here we go. I'll start with Hinkie. Hinkie, I think, is the easiest one to explain, because even throughout the process, what he would be public about and talking about his philosophy is that the draft is a crapshoot. The name of my podcast is sort of a parody of that, because I think you can find value in the draft, but I call it chucking darts because a lot of people call it, you're just throwing darts at the dartboard, as if these players like don't have personalities and like unique skill sets and ways to evaluate their game. But Hinkie, even though he regards the draft as a crapshoot, he's a data guy. He likes certainty. I would assume that the uncertainty with Giannis is what spooked him away. That is what, if you're asking me, I bet he had like an analytics department and he looked probably at the history of European picks. This is coming from such a low league. No players ever come from Greece. And there was just so much more data to other players that is what pushed him there. With Ainge, I mean, I don't want to be indelicate. And by the way, I think they traded for Olynyk. I think they didn't have the 13th pick, but they traded into that slot.
Yes.
And I believe when Giannis got picked, the team that I think the Bucks were like not trading him. They had figured out, we've got something here. We're not trading this guy. But the reason I think Ainge would not have, for instance, demanded that the team picking 13th take Giannis and then they acquire that pick instead of Olynyk, You know, you took Peyton Pritchard. Ainge, he's in Utah now. I think he's got a thing for certain kind of players from the Northwest. And Kelly Olynyk went to Gonzaga. I'm just
White.
saying, yeah. I mean, I think yes. I think that Ainge kind of, and that's Ainge's background. I'm not real. It's like, look, he is from that area. He likes hard nosed guys. Olynyk was good at Gonzaga. He wasn't a bad player.
Yeah,
He's
no,
had a
he
good
was. Yeah,
career for a given 13th overall pick in a draft.
totally
You take
fine.
average 13th pick, good career.
Yeah.
It's just more that how it's again how ballsy are you going to be and how well can you see the vision with a guy like Giannis? And his ascent the last 10 years is so remarkable because there was no other player really like him that I get how GMs would fall back on their given philosophies, stuff that had already succeeded to a moderate degree to them rather than take the plunge. And I think that Ainge obviously should have taken Giannis because what I said about before about his athleticism, guarding the best players in the world. But I can see how you'd be spooked by the uncertainty. The one that I don't forgive at all is Presti. And Presti is arguably the best drafter in the league. But what we were talking about investing resources into the draft, he's in OKC. He knows that the only way that you're going to acquire big time talent is to draft it. That's basically all you're ever going to do. And so I guarantee that at the time, they had as good a draft department as anyone. And they knew some of this stuff about where the league was going, the kind of players they want to invest in, and like what matters at the highest levels in the NBA. And he took Steven Adams, who again had a good career. Steven Adams is a good player, but that is a classic. We think he's a missing piece for something our team needs.
Absolutely.
And look, at pick 12, which is where he went, most of the time there's not going to be a star available. Again, if you go by traditional draft history, most of the time that's going to be the case. But given the guys that he likes, young, Giannis was one of the youngest players in the draft. So another thing in his favor. Athletic, big wingspan, like really stuff that pops relative to other draft classes. I think that it was sort of the a pretty obvious choice for them because you can get a center, and that was sort of the Achilles heel of those Thunder teams. They had Ibaka, but they also kept favoring playing Ibaka with another big because they kept playing Kendrick Perkins too. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm like shitting on Steven Adams because Adams is like a really fun player who's had a great career, but Giannis was there, and Presti should have seen it with his philosophy, with his market, with the way he built that team. And if he had pulled the trigger and taken Giannis, you wouldn't hear a peep about the James Harden trade because that pick came from the James Harden trade. So if
that's
he
a good point. Yeah.
If he traded Harden and he had Giannis to show for it, then he's like the god. You wouldn't
exactly. It's like, I got rid of one of the 50 greatest players of all time and then got one of the 50 greatest players of all time. Yeah, not a big deal at all.
And then and I get it because they were on a championship timeline because they were like right there in the finals. But still, man, you always, in a small market, you have to look forward all the time.
That's exactly what I was just going to say is like, you have Kevin Durant in his prime. I understand the idea behind getting a more of a plug and play guy, even though, by the way, Steven Adams was also very young. Like he was he was like one of the younger players in the draft. So it's not like he was this upperclassman that you were like, oh, we could just put him in and he'll have a role and blah, blah, blah. But like this idea that like, okay, I have Kevin Durant right now, but in 3 years from now, Kevin Durant's going to be a free agent. And maybe he could leave for a super team. I don't know. Maybe that could happen. And in order for like, that is the reason why, like, obviously there's a ton of hindsight bias here. Like I go to the YouTube comments of these draft videos and everyone's like, Giannis should have went 1. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to go that far because we just didn't know anything about Giannis at the time. But when you're getting towards the middle of the lottery, towards the end of the lottery, that kind of swing makes sense, especially given the history of players that he likes to go for, and that kind of like basic philosophy, as you said, like who are guys I could see playing in the finals, who are guys that I could see in the context of a championship roster.
Mhm.
And it does feel like the one time that Presti was like, you know what, I'm going to take the safer pick, ended up being the time that he missed out on Giannis, which is crazy to me. And once again, Presti's a very good GM, one of the best. And like what he's been able to do in Seattle and now Oklahoma City, like is pretty remarkable. And like,
he's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, he's this is one of the few times that he might have missed on a truly like a generational level player and like made the wrong move. And like, I don't want to like doubt him too much for that, but just considering all the things that we have discussed, it doesn't really make a ton of sense to me. Now, just hypothetically thinking about this more, I have another point here, which is like, I just said, like, Giannis would have never went one unless you're doing this with 100% complete hindsight bias, which is you take the best player, you get, and like Giannis became the best player. So like, whatever. But I had this thought exercise, which was basically like, if Giannis goes number 1 overall, and he's the best player in this draft, we know he goes 1, Cleveland takes the ultimate upside swing with him at 1. How does that affect LeBron and like him coming back? Because we think about like, okay, he comes back the next year and the Cavs at the time had Bennett and they had the number 1 pick the next year with Wiggins, which they then traded for Kevin Love. And I just think about it like, because people always bring up from the 2014 draft, like, do they draft Embiid at 1 and do they keep Embiid if they have LeBron and Kyrie? And I still think they probably trade for the sure thing and Kevin Love and all that stuff. But like this idea of Giannis went number 1 somehow, like there was more info on him and like people really did their research and they're like, they just go for the ultimate number 1 upside swing. That like, what if LeBron just like doesn't come back because Cleveland's like, oh, well, we have this stud guy, that number 1 overall. Not that they would turn down LeBron James if he wanted to come back. I'm not saying that. But what if they were like, okay, we're going to rebuild, we're going to do all this. And I guess they would still be bad enough to have the number 1 pick in the next draft. So like you could say, but like also on top of that, what if all of this happens and then he gets traded to Minnesota and Giannis is in Minnesota and then LeBron comes back and it's like, we traded away Giannis. Like I was like, the idea that this would ever happen is insane, but I just, that thought exercise in itself was amazing to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's what would have happened. If they had if Cleveland had somehow taken Giannis, LeBron still comes back. Who knows if they get the number 1 pick the next year or not? But in trading for Love, they would not have had leverage because LeBron would be mandating you need to improve this roster. So they 100%. Could say, we're protecting Giannis, so you can have our good pick now, but we're keeping Giannis. The other team would be like, no, we want Giannis or you're not getting our player.
Yeah. And
eventually they'd have their, they'd be pinned to the wall, and that's what they would have done. And then all of this narrative about how LeBron just shouted out in the same week Sam Presti for his eye for talent and Les Snead for hating draft picks, which is a little contradictory. But his reputation would have been like, you traded Giannis.
Yeah, exactly. Like we criticize him now for the things that he does to like make his teams win now. And then when he leaves, they're fucked basically. Like that would have been the ultimate prime example of this, like going for that win now. But at the same time, it's like kind of contradictory with what we talked about earlier, which is like, if you have a high pick and there is a prospect like a James Harden or a Jimmy Butler or someone like that, like take the sure thing, generally speaking. But like, there's also a world where like they get Giannis in-house and they're like, nope, we're not trade. Like after Giannis's rookie year, if you had Giannis in-house, you knew how hard he worked, you knew the upside he had, and you knew that this guy could become what he has become. I mean, maybe once again, even after his rookie year, probably even after his second year, no one saw this level of good. But like, there is a world where like we just have a LeBron James Giannis team with like Kyrie. It's it would be an insane thing to see. I don't even know how it would work, but I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we weren't too far from a Russ, Harden, Giannis, Durant. Or I guess you would have to be either
Was
Harden or
traded, but
Giannis
yeah.
because it was traded. But I mean, Russ, Durant, Giannis, and Ibaka. I mean, it's right there. It's all right there. The Mavericks are the team that I think traded Kelly Olynyk to the Celtics. And
Yes.
I've heard stories about Donnie Nelson begging Cuban to take Giannis because he's like, Giannis is good. Please take Giannis. And Cuban is like, Dwight Howard's a free agent. We need to open up cap space. We're going to sell this.
Oh,
I mean, this is how these guys think. And again, to defend them a little, it's rare that you get a value like that in the teens of a draft.
of course.
But that's also circular thinking because you go, well, if someone's in the teens, if they fall into the teens, they can't be that good.
Right.
But Jimmy Butler went 30th in 2011. Kawhi went 14th in 2011. Like the values are there if you understand where the league is going.
Yeah, absolutely. And having that forward thinking mindset is almost always beneficial. It's funny you talk about like they would have had Ibaka, Kevin Durant, Giannis, like that's where the league is going now. And this was like having those big skilled guys that were like long and athletic, like whatever the brainchild of Masai Ujiri is happening right now in Toronto is like what would have happened almost 10 years ago now at this time had he selected Giannis at that point. I mean, it's crazy to think, but just a few other things that happened actually during the draft here before we get into like whatever like the reactions were after and we do our little redraft at the end. So first off, I don't know if you saw this clip, but when Gobert was drafted, I don't think this was included, but we went into it and we were like, oh, we'll go back and we'll rewatch the draft. But for copyright reasons, they took down the draft for some reason and they only have the highlights of it. But I, like a sicko, have watched this multiple times because I just, when I'm bored, I watch old drafts. And one of the things that Bill Simmons said when the Rudy Gobert pick went, I believe he was 29 in this draft.
27.
27. Okay. So when the Rudy Gobert pick happened, Bill Simmons said, what does standing reach mean? Which is basically like his standing reach at the time was like 9 feet.
Yeah.
And they were like, well, that means that you can like, basically you can almost touch the rim. And he's like, how did this guy not go number 1 overall? Like, he was like, you're telling me this guy barely has to jump to touch the rim? He was like, the measurables from Rudy Gobert at the time, he was like, this guy literally should have went number 1 overall. He's 27.
So have you had Jake Fisher on your show?
I have not.
Okay. So you know that he wrote his book about the process that was called Built to Lose. Yeah. So in that, I had him on my show talking about that book and there's a great anecdote and it's going to be a little painful for your audience and maybe for you, God. But like you said, this is the process draft, right? And so wisdom, conventional or not conventional wisdom, but like wisdom says that Hinkys should have been very open-minded about taking like projects, maybe even Giannis or whatever. And there's a line that Josh Harris, I think he was the owner at the time, right? Was he not?
Yeah, he was.
Yeah. So
they had just bought the team a few years before.
They were in some meeting and they were trying to figure out who the best players were in the draft. Because then there was all this uncertainty around the conventional top of the draft because there was no star according to, the thinking at the time. And Josh Harris's child, I don't remember if they were a boy or girl, but it was like some 8-9-year-old kid is like, well, I like Rudy Gobert. I think Gobert's really good. He's like this massive center. And everyone in the room laughed like, pat you on the head. Oh, you little scamp. And that, I mean, I've done some research into looking at bigs and international bigs because you do get standing reach guys like Mo Bamba that don't quite pan out. Like you can't, or Taco Fall or Bowl. What Gobert did is we're talking about the Euroleague and European leagues. The French league is one of the best domestic leagues in Europe. And he played in the best French league, like the major league French league. And he shot 70% from the field. He just finished everything. No one could stop him. And he had these outrageous block numbers because he's Rudy Gobert. Like he's already good. Like what my little corner of draft Twitter and whatever, all of it basically just means the players that have the best chance to succeed in the NBA are players who are already like really good at basketball. And if you can affect the game that well in a French league, in a pro league with grown men around you, then you're going to be a good center. Like you're just going to play well. With Bol, you had to squint because it's like, well, he's not really that good. Oregon isn't that good with him. Mo Bamba, that Texas team was like a 7 seed and then lost in the first round of the tournament. Gobert's like with pros and like dominating them. It's a big reason why Şengün had his fans in this past draft. Same idea. So yeah, he should have gone way, way higher than 27. But if you watch that broadcast, and I know you have, whenever there's an international pick, they're like, bring in Fran. And Fran Fraschilla like, well, here's the actual scouting report on these guys. Like they just, at the time, they just did not do their homework as much, at least on the broadcast, on international players. And I bet that thinking translated to the rest of the league too.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember every draft being like, I remember at one point it was almost like kind of offensive when they would talk about European players. Because first off, they put them all in the same, like they would describe them the same exact way. They would always compare them to another European who had previously played. And I can't remember which draft it was, but I remember, I don't even know if it was a rewatch or if I just remember this, but it was like, there hasn't been a European all-star drafted since Pau Gasol. And it was like, this was like years after Pau Gasol was drafted. And it's like, well, you know, that kind of thinking, just because there hasn't been a prospect who has come from Europe doesn't mean there cannot be. Like clearly, over the past 10 years, we've seen this absolute explosion coming over. More guys tend to come over to the NBA now, and maybe it's because we have now invested more in overseas scouting that these guys are getting more discovered. But even less than 10 years ago, as I said, as recent as the 2018 draft, people are just completely overthinking these overseas prospects. And I think that it's finally getting to the point where we might know a little bit more about them going into the draft. And like, it still feels, it's funny you bring up Şengün, because like, I remember going in the draft and being like, I don't really like Şengün because I don't really know all that much about him. But having watched him this year, I then go and I'm like, okay, now I can see why he had his fans. Drafting good basketball players who are playing in good leagues has value to it. And like when you're playing, I think which league did he play in? Did he play in
Turkish?
He
was the MVP of the Turkish league at 18 years old.
At 18 years old, like even if he doesn't like have maybe the upside of some other picks that you think about, like he's already clearly good at basketball, and he's going to be at least a rotational player in the NBA, which like when you get towards, you know, the middle of the first round, a lot of the times those guys don't even end up being NBA players at all. So yeah, it is funny to me that like, as far along as we have come with the European prospects and the overseas guys, it still does feel like we have a long way to go. And like, that might be, I always forget the term. What is the fucking, I literally use it on the podcast all the time and I can't remember. It's like the Hinky Mori term, which is like the the market thing. I don't know how.
Market inefficiency?
Market inefficiency. Like European players might just be like, continue to be this market inefficiency of like, we can get a good European guy lower in the draft because we just don't know as much about them. And like, we still to this day, like we don't have, you know, they're not playing in the tournament and they're not getting all this press and media and blah, blah, blah. It seems like that might be a market inefficiency, similar to like how Moore used to talk about drafting like upperclassmen was like a market inefficiency of like, I can get at the end of the first round and the beginning of the second round, like a guy who played 3 years in college and might not be thought of as this like amazing prospect because of that. But like, I can plug him into my rotation right now. And I know that he's going to be a good player on a cheap contract for a few years.
And so that happened in this draft. That was Tim Hardaway Jr., who was ended up the better player from Trey Burke's team than Trey Burke.
Exactly. Which is, it's a perfect example of it. But so, all right. So let's just go down to, I just want to hit on 2 points. What they said after the draft, which was from that Simmons and Ford podcast, which is, so first off, this was before the media turned on Sam Hinkie. this was his first draft. This was the beginning of the process. This was like the just genesis of the process, essentially. So when they discussed it afterwards, the Drew Holiday trade, which we discussed, which was the 6th pick, which they used for Nerlens Noel, and the pick that ended up becoming Dario Saric, who at the time when they were talking about the prospects from the 2014 draft in the 2013 post draft, they didn't even mention Joel Embiid. They mentioned Saric.
Oh, no. Ford brings him up. He calls him Joel Embiid, but he's he was more of an unknown guy because he just had such an atypical background. Like he came to basketball so late, but he's going to be at Kansas with Wiggins, and he moves really well for a 7-footer. And like Ford liked him. He didn't have him at the top, when he did that post draft, but he did mention him. Yeah.
Okay, good. I was going to say, I was surprised because I remember even going into his freshman year, he had some buzz towards the top of the draft, but he was never thought to be like this number 1 overall pick. That was Wiggins was going into that process.
That's right.
Was Wiggins. And everyone was like, oh, it's the Wiggins draft, winless for Wiggins, blah, blah, blah. So the Sixers end up coming out from that draft with the pick that became Saric in the 2014 draft. But they were like, we love this for them because, and my whole thing with this is like, and older people, this is not younger people who understand the NBA, like people that listen to my podcast that are like tuned into the process and how all this stuff works and blah, blah, blah. But like older people are like, we should have never traded away Drew Holiday. And I'm like, the point of trading away Drew Holiday was so you could be bad, and you could be bad enough to get one of those top. So if you keep Drew Holiday, you're probably not bad enough, because this was at the time before they even readjusted the lottery odds, that you would not have been bad enough to get Joel Embiid. So ultimately, what came from that was a pick bad enough to get Joel Embiid, and I think we can all agree we would rather have Joel Embiid right now than whatever would have come from keeping Drew Holiday and that team together.
Yeah, I mean, unless you just wanted to take Giannis at 11 and trade for Rudy Gobert at the end of the first round.
So
I'm kidding.
No, I did have this thought was if they drafted, because Giannis, I mean, I don't really remember young Giannis in the NBA all that much, but like if they drafted Giannis at 11, I don't think he would have had like a major impact on winning in his rookie year, right?
No. He's 18 years old. And this is another thing that I study a lot for my podcast and talk about. But like, there's a perception that all rookies are like bad players as rookies, that they just aren't, because they're in a league of grown professionals and they just aren't good yet. That is especially true for sort of like for 18, 19-year-olds. So that most like college freshmen, if you remember college, you turn 19 during your freshman year, most do. But for basketball prospects, they actually manipulate it most of the time so that they're 19 for the whole of their freshman year. Chet Holmgren's been 19 this whole time. So when you get someone who is 18 and like played their freshman year of college at 18, they're entering the draft, they just turned 19. That first year, almost always, no matter how good they are, is like a growing pains kind of year. And that's what Giannis's was. I think in his second year, the Bucks made the playoffs and got like swept by the Bulls, second or third. But he didn't start really popping as a future star until his second or third year. His first year was like, oh, this guy belongs in the NBA. He's not a bust. Like they've got something, but that's all it was. It would not have pushed Philly like very high if they had him on the team.
So you're telling me there's a world where Giannis comes in as a rookie, doesn't impact winning all that much, to the point where the Sixers are still bad enough to get a top pick. And yeah, it could be a butterfly effect thing. It could be maybe if they draft Giannis, whatever. But like, there is a world where the sliding doors moment, to quote our friend Bill Simmons, is the Sixers draft Giannis. He's this tantalizing young, good prospect with crazy upside. And then the next year they take Joel Embiid, and the Sixers have Giannis Antetokounmpo and Joel Embiid. And maybe I'm not here right now talking to you if that happens. Maybe I'm just like a happy person that like lives and doesn't have to like doesn't have to like theorize about all this, like things that could have happened. So maybe overall it was a good thing that that this did end up happening. So that maybe that was the major butterfly effect.
Yeah, we
But
wouldn't be having this discussion, and this is a lovely
yeah.
conversation. So seems
So
worth it to
thank you,
me.
Sam Hinkie. Thank you for for passing on Giannis so I can have this podcast and love Joel Embiid as much as I do. And because it would have become a Giannis versus Embiid thing like they did with Simmons, even though but then again, if they win titles, maybe it isn't. Who fucking knows? I mean, God, it's insane to think that like that would have been the absolute perfect scenario. But once again, we are not living in that world. So let's get into our redraft because we're going to redraft the lottery. We're going to steal from the ringer and do our redraftables now, which I will call from now on the Reslopables. Shout out to Emart who came up with that name, the Emart. He's been on the podcast a few times. But so why don't you go with the number 1 overall pick? I think we know who this is going to be. We've discussed it enough, and then we can go back and forth throughout the lottery.
Okay. All right. So this is with hindsight, you're saying?
With hindsight.
Okay. So then Giannis would go number 1. I'll say that if I were in the moment but I had my current like scouting philosophy, I would probably have gone with Oladipo.
Right.
Because I mean, again, Giannis all the way at 1 is, I mean, that's bold. But when you look back at a draft where the party line was there's no guaranteed star, that's usually the point at any given draft where you should take the swing, because what you're missing out on, what you're passing up at that point of the draft, is just like a solid starter. And it's okay to pass up a solid starter if you have the potential to hit big. So that sort of thinking does argue for Giannis even in the moment. But I probably would have gone with Oladipo in the moment. But for this Reslopables, I take Giannis Antetokounmpo.
Yeah, I think that is sound logic. I probably would have taken Trey Burke at number 1 because I just love buckets of no, but in reality, Depot like at the time seems like the safest pick. Once again, everything we talked about with Depot makes total sense. But if we are going with the benefit of hindsight, Giannis is the obvious number 1. So with the number 2 pick overall, I will I'll suck it up and select Rudy Gobert. Gobert clearly the second best player from this draft. So he would have went to Orlando at the time, which is kind of funny. Like, this was before they got. So if I remember correctly, John Hammond was the GM of the Bucks at the time, right? When they selected. Okay, so the wingspan guy was not even in Orlando at the time. He was, as Magic fans have called him, the wingspan merchant. Well, the one time he was a wingspan merchant, it actually turned out pretty fucking great for him with drafting Giannis Antetokounmpo with the 15th pick. So Rudy Gobert, one of the greatest defenders of all time. Regardless of how you feel about him, multiple time defensive player of the year, his absolutely dominant defensive player, especially during the regular season. He would go number 2. I think that's pretty clear. I don't really think that there's an argument for anyone else to go at number 2. So who are you going to go with at number 3?
Good question. I mean, this is between Oladipo and CJ McCollum, right?
Same.
So, it's the easy thing to do is to say McCollum, because even though Oladipo had the higher high, he's had all these injury concerns. McCollum is still like this relevant, good player. But I also get the sense that Oladipo's career has been sort of snake bit with the situations that he's been in. And McCollum's, he hasn't been an all-star because he's played in the West. In that respect, he's been snake bit, but he's been in a pretty good situation playing next to Dame on that team.
True.
So I don't know. I'll say for argument's sake, I'll go with Depot because I think that Depot translates a bit more to like the finals. Again, which one of these guys at their peak could have been on a finals team, I think Depot is more likely because he's a better defender. He can play 2 ways, but very close call.
Yeah, I had a hard time with this one too, because like you said, like at his peak, Victor Oladipo, that one and a half season that he had in Indiana, where he was like a top 20 player, like he was a clear all-star, he was really good, fits the mold of exactly what you want from your star player in the modern NBA. I totally understand that. I probably would have went with CJ, and that's why I'm going to pick CJ at 4. I just think like the longevity of CJ doesn't, and I might end up regretting saying this because smaller guards tend to not age super well, but and he had his own injury issues and all that stuff. But like, if he was in the East, as you said, I think he's a clear, at least a few time All-Star, like sneaking in as one of the lower tiered All-Stars. I think playing in the West with all those guards is just an insane task for the majority. He'll probably never make an All-Star team in his career. He'll probably be one of the best players from this era to never make an All-Star team. Depot made 2, I believe. And the other thing that people don't really talk about with Oladipo is like, it's really hard to develop when you're on a new team every year. And like,
absolutely.
By the time you're 20, like he was 25 years old, I believe, by the time he made his first All-Star team. And it's like he had played for Orlando in a bad situation. I mean, think about who they trade. Like they traded him and Sabonis away for Serge Ibaka and then let Serge Ibaka. Like that's the kind of dysfunction that was happening at the time in Orlando. And then you have the fact that he gets traded then again in the Paul George trade from Oklahoma City. He's playing largely off of a ball-dominant Russell Westbrook at the time, too. He doesn't really even get an opportunity to be like an on-ball featured guy on a like decent team until he gets to the Pacers. And who knows, if he doesn't hurt his quad and like have all these crazy injuries, like it's possible he could have continued to be just as good as he was that season or gotten even better. And like, if you want to just like remove injuries from the situation and talk about all the things you talk about, I think there is an argument for Depot to go number 3, but I probably would have had him at 4 just because we do have the benefit of hindsight. And like, we know that Depot might just never be an NBA player again. And it's possible that CJ McCollum could be for the next 5 years, like a good NBA player. And he already has been for quite some time.
It's yeah. I think either is a very good pick. And Depot, you know, people forget that that Pacers team should have beaten the LeBron team in 2018, 2017, 2018.
Yeah. It was 2017, 2018 season, I believe.
They were the better team in that series. And the reason they lost it was basically because Nate McMillan would bench Oladipo when he picked up a couple fouls instead of understanding that it is more valuable to have your best player on the floor for as long as possible rather than worrying about a clutch time that may never come because you benched your player and now you're losing. So that, I mean, if he wins that series, even with his injuries, I think the narrative on him is much, much different. A good tidbit on CJ that I want to point out that speaks to the thinking at the time. CJ, like mid-major, Lehigh, goes 10th, which is still like a solid slot, but he wasn't talked about it was a top 6 in this draft, and CJ was not included in that.
I do just want to give credit to Bill Simmons. He had CJ he said in 10 years, we're going to look back and he'll be a top 5 player from this draft.
And he's absolutely right. And the reason I think that, or I shouldn't say it that way, but like the rep on CJ now is like really good offensive player and sort of like a defensive liability, right? And in the Patriot League where Lehigh was, if you go back and look at his numbers, he was like a defensive beast. And it just goes to show that even an average NBA defender who that's perceived as a weakness in his game, when he's in college, especially if it's not against top D1 competition, he should be destroying everyone everywhere. And that's what CJ did. And you see this a lot with shooters, guys who are perceived as not great NBA shooters. You go back and look at their college numbers like, oh, that guy shot 38% from 3. It's if you're really good at one level, you tend to be able to play at the next. It's not like your weakness follows you all the way through. So
yeah, absolutely. And one of the things about CJ, so once again, keep in mind, this is before I really followed the draft or even really followed the NBA as intensely as I do now. I was obsessed with bucket getters and I was obsessed with guys who could shoot because I was like, those are the kind of players I like to watch. And also I was completely biased by March Madness and I had watched CJ McCollum take down that Duke team.
That's right.
Not that like I remember watching and being like, this guy is single-handedly kicking Duke's ass and being like, he has to be an NBA player. Like, I remember at the time thinking that he should have went higher because I actually wanted the Sixers to draft. Also, it helps when you go to Lehigh. Like if you go to school in Pennsylvania or the general Philly area, like Lehigh's in Bethlehem, but it's like an hour away. Like people here will think you're Michael Jordan. Like they will think you're the second coming of Steph Curry. Like that's all you really need in order for people to be. And also like one of the things that like I don't know if people saw the NBA going in this direction at the time, but like this was pre-Warriors. And it's not to say that like the Blazers were close to the Warriors, but like this was pre-Steph Curry becoming Steph Curry and like the shooting revolution. So like CJ McCollum being the shooter that he was thought to be valuable, but he probably has a better, more valuable career due to the fact that he played during the shooting spacing era. And he was one of the best shooters and floor spacers.
And played
he
and
definitely
played off of
benefited
Dame
from that as well.
Yeah, and I believe he was a 4-year player at Lehigh, and
3 or
again,
4, yeah.
Most of the wisdom about draft stuff was to say that's a negative because they aren't good enough to get to the NBA until they're 21, 22. But CJ's breakout year was in his second year. And if you're looking at it from a salary cap perspective, that means that you have a positive player in the second year on the rookie contract, which means you get 3 years of like real production as opposed to waiting out the growing pains with a younger guy. So there's just arguments both sides for it.
Yeah, and
it's like Duarte in the most recent draft in Indiana.
Exactly. Yeah. More of a sure thing, kind of a guy who can plug and play, whatever. You get, and Cam Johnson is another guy that is used as like the example of this as well. But the funny thing about the CJ McCollum thing is like it allowed the Blazers to have that 2016 offseason that like if they don't blow that, we could be talking like at the time there was the cap spike. They have all this cap space, like because CJ was still on his rookie deal. I believe Dame was entering the first year of his second contract. Like it gives teams the opportunity to like really have a chance to build a really good team. The Blazers just blew that opportunity because of that offseason, basically.
That's right.
So 5th pick. This is where it starts to get interesting because to me the top 4 are pretty clear. Like I think those are clearly the 4 best players from this draft. Now there's like somewhat of a teardrop. Like you go from like your superstar player at the top, your all-star defensive player of the year at 2, and then you have your like fringe all-stars at 3 and 4. And then who did you have for the 5th pick? Because I had some thoughts on this, and I'm fine with the guy I ended up going with, but who did you have?
Yeah. God. I'm not confident.
It's a sharp drop off.
I know, man. I will probably go with Otto Porter.
Okay.
I'll say Otto Porter. And he goes 3rd in this draft. He was a 2-year player at Georgetown before entering the league. And still in the league, still like a productive member of a good team. He's back of the Warriors rotation now. But similar to how I said Oladipo's career was kind of snake bit with where he went, Porter is in Washington for a while, and they're a team who, you know, we talk about the rarity of trading picks for players. As soon as they had Beal and Wall and Porter, they started trading first rounders every single year. Got to get Markieff Morris, got to get Marcin Gortat, got to get Bojan Bogdanovic, because they were just trying to be just as good as they were for that next season and beyond. And we can debate the merits of that, but it put a ceiling on their team to where they're sort of thought of, I think, as kind of like an also-ran, maybe an underachieving team in the East. But if they had built their team a bit more patiently, Porter, who he could shoot and he could pass and he could defend on the wing at 6'8". I think he was a guy in his prime who could have been a starter on like a conference finals or a finals team. And after Washington, you know, there's reports about him like not really being in shape. He got hurt a little bit, went to Chicago, sort of bounced around. But if he's in a better situation,
party during pandemics.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah.
But if he had been with a team that was a bit less of a mess than the Wiz ended up being, then I think that he is he's just like a very solid forward starter, sort of in the way that Nick Batum has found a renaissance with the Clips.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of a similar kind of thing with Porter. And that is something that every team in the league can use. So over the balance of his career for how good he was, I would go with Porter.
Yeah, I think just from a positional value standpoint, once
Right.
again, shooting, big wing, can pass, defend. He can do everything that you want from like your fourth starter, basically. Like he's
Exactly.
the perfect kind of fourth starter that you want. And maybe if he didn't have the injuries and he was in a better situation, maybe even that third starter, maybe even like a fringe all-star type guy he could have become. Like and be more in that tier with CJ and Oladipo. And I tend to agree with that. I had him at 6. I had
Okay.
Steven Adams at 5, and
I thought about it. Yeah.
and those were the two that I went back and forth with because we talk about like, and once again, Steven Adams went to a very good situation for him. He was asked to go to Oklahoma City and be the role player guy, set screens for Russell Westbrook, play competitive defense. Like he was drafted to the perfect situation for him. And so, but he's not someone we have to theorize about, like, what would he look like on a really good team in a good situation. We saw that, and it was good. He was a good player on good teams for years. He was a fourth, fifth guy on those teams. Like, and I think that he still continues to prove his value with the Memphis Grizzlies right now. He has just been he's been a cog in the machine of good teams for so long that I think at this point in the draft where I'm not like we're getting more theoretical than actual, I'll take the actual over the theoretical and I'll go with Steven Adams at number 6. So
Yeah.
number 7, you are up.
Okay, and a quick shout out on Adams. This is something that has changed since 2013, and I think that teams probably should have been a bit more in on again with how the wings were the best players in the league. But Adams is the third, maybe arguably fourth true center taken in the lottery. Noel goes before him, Cody Zeller goes before him, and Alex Len goes before him. And that just like you won't find that now because none of those guys had like really great foolproof cases. Alex Len averaged like 12 points a game. Zeller was a kind of the same. They seemed destined to be just sort of like fine, like rotational, maybe starting NBA centers. And that's just stuff that doesn't get valued as highly in the draft anymore. And again, Gobert is there in the 20s. So just very interesting there. For 7, another tough one. Again, I'm thinking between two guys here. And I'm going to go, let's see, what's the better discussion? I'm going to go with Tim Hardaway Jr.
Okay.
At 7. I was between him and Kentavious. And you know, the theory behind both guys is similar. You know, Kentavious, the easy sell on him is he basically started or was like the 6th man on a championship team. So there's only so far that you should drop someone who can contribute at that level. And he is very good defender, and he gets sort of the D&3 moniker now. But again, these guys are good. NBA players are so good before they get to the NBA. He was a 2-year guy at Georgia, and Kentavious was the SEC Player of the Year and 18 points and 7 rebounds with like very good defensive numbers at Georgia in his sophomore year. And it makes sense that he was good, and he was valued in the draft. I think he went 8th. The reason I go with THJ over him is that I think that, you know, he goes to the Knicks, number 24. Knicks are a mess. He goes to Atlanta. He sort of pops with Atlanta a little bit under Budenholzer. I think he is a member of that 60-win team that was like Corver and Teague and all them.
Yeah, I
but
think
maybe
he was
I'm a
on
year
that
off.
team. Yeah.
So then the Knicks sign him back as a restricted free agent. They give him a big contract. It's another mess.
By the way, has that ever happened before? I don't think I've ever heard of that. It's only the Knicks.
If it happened, it was with the Knicks, I can promise you. So they're another mess. And then he gets traded in the Porzingis deal to go to Dallas. And now he's a high volume, very good 3-point shooter. Someone who can definitely play off of like a really, really good player, similar to how Kentavious can do it. The reason I lean Hardaway is that I think he's a little bit bigger than Kentavious. His defense is okay. Not great, but it's okay. It can survive in a playoff setting. And he has a bit more creativity to his offensive game. So if you imagine high leverage playoff stuff where, defense is really being played. I'd want someone who wasn't so dependent on whether or not their three goes in. And that
Yep.
Kentavious is a bit more dependent on that. So with Hardaway having more size, a bit more offensive juice, I go with him.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Bubble Contavious Caldwell Pope might have went number 4 in this.
I know he went nuts. Yeah,
like when Contavious and he's someone that I've wanted the Sixers to get since the Lakers traded him. Like I've been like try to steal him from the Wizards because the Sixers just need like wings who can defend and like do the little things. And I like KCP a lot. I actually, funny enough, with the Tim Hardaway thing, I had him a little bit lower because I might have cheated a little bit. I went and I looked at the undrafted players from here, and there were some pretty good undrafted
there were
players.
I forgot, but now that you mention it, yeah, I had looked at that in preparation for this, but when I went to do the redraft, I forgot about him. So yeah, no, go ahead. Take
yeah. So I have Robert Covington as my pick here. So I had Covington 7 on my board. Love to get him here a little bit lower. So Covington, we've seen him. I think he might be now. If you want to compare him to like Kentavious Caldwell Pope. Kentavious Caldwell Pope has proven it, and maybe yes, that was in the bubble and stuff, and with the Lakers and in a perfect context for him. And like, I still think that like Robert Covington, although he isn't the player that he once was, it can be a very valuable player on a good team. Put up a ton of threes, play great, help defense, do all the things that you want your role players to do, your fifth starter, whatever. We've seen Covington struggle a little bit in the playoffs because his 3 is super streaky and he's incredibly reliant on that as well. But his help defense when he was at his peak was absolutely elite. He made all defense, I think 1 or 2 seasons. I know he did with the Sixers. He made first team all defense 1 year. The on-ball stuff leaves a little bit to be desired. If he's playing in a switching system, we could, Chris Paul put him into the air fryer in the bubble. So like he definitely has some shortcomings, but we are to the point where like, I think he's a player who's been on a lot of good teams and could contribute in like to a championship team in like the perfect context for him, even though his value might go down a little bit in the playoffs. So I'm going to take Robert Covington there.
Yeah, and so he's in a great situation to be an eventual, starter on a great team now because with LA, he'll be playing off of hopefully Kawhi and Paul George next season. However, I can still at least make my pitch for Hardaway over Covington in retrospect because what you mentioned is that he's very good in help, but when he's on ball, when he gets switched on to someone with real offensive chops, he can get abused a little bit. The Covington thing is that he now is a 4. He's a power forward in the NBA. And if you, again, as you advance in the playoffs, the best players that you play round 2, round 3, round 4 are going to be nominal power forwards. Now we can talk about positionless basketball, but like LeBron 6'8", Luka 6'8", Giannis 7 foot, eventually like Evan Mobley, Jason Tatum. All these guys are really, really big. And so you want the guy that you're going to put on them to be able to actually check them and hold up. And if Covington is your 4, then I think you are asking to eventually, he's like just good enough to get beat. You know what I mean? That's
right. Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that is why if I'm making the case for Hardaway over him, I would say Hardaway doesn't take that assignment, but maybe you can get someone better than Covington in that spot and still play Hardaway and get his offensive value. But it's like,
and you
it's
can
a very good debate.
You can hide Hardaway a little bit easier because of, he's not nearly the level of defender, but like you can basically like his defense wouldn't matter as much. You can plug in someone at the 4. I just think about like, what is the perfect context for a Robert Covington? And I think about like his role when he was on the Sixers, his role, if he was in the Kentavious Caldwell Pope role with the Lakers, like they have LeBron James, Anthony Davis, who can handle those assignments right now with the Clippers, Paul George, Kawhi Leonard. So like maybe from a team building perspective, he doesn't fit because of those shortcomings as an on-ball defender. but in the right context on a great team that can kind of cover up some of that stuff, that he could be like a high level role player.
And I think the Clippers is that context, because when they play really good wings, they have the guys to guard them that isn't Covington. That's the thing. They have Paul George and Kawhi. It's just, for most teams, you're not going to have that caliber of a wing to have Covington play off and be in his ideal scenario. But
So he's figured out the perfect role for him. So or the perfect team for him, I should say. So we have a few more left here. Are you going to take our boy Kentavious at the next pick?
Yeah, there's another guy I noticed in those undrafteds.
Yes,
but I'll take Kentavious. So
okay.
Go ahead.
So you'll take Kentavious there. Seth Curry, I will be taking with the next pick. Of course, I'm just taking all the former Sixers now. Weird to say that Seth Curry is a former Sixer. But yeah, I mean, what can you say about Seth? Like Seth is a late bloomer. He didn't really get opportunities. He had injuries early in his career. He bounced around, started in the G League. Didn't really catch on until that year in Portland when he was coming off the bench as a backup for CJ McCollum and Damian Lillard. He ends up going back to Dallas. My thing with Seth is like, I feel like, we know about the defensive concerns. His size, we saw him get bullied in the playoffs by Kevin Huerter. We saw all that shit. But we're now at the point with these guys where like I can look past a flaw like that because of the elite skill of the shooting and the improved ball handling. And like, even as an on-ball guy, like, Seth's one of the best mid-range shooters in the NBA. He can get to his spots. He can create his own looks. And he's also just like such a good fit with so many stars. He played like historically good offensive rating when him and Luka were on the court in Dallas. Insanely good offensive rating when Joel Embiid and him were playing here in Philadelphia. Perfect fit with Joel Embiid. And then you have the fact that Joel can cover up some of the defensive things that he has. And then I think right now, defensively, I think a lot of those lineups are going to struggle in Brooklyn. But I just think offensively with Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant, Seth Curry, Ben Simmons, like I think those lineups are going to be insanely good offensively, and that Seth can fit on a lot of teams because of the fact that he's such a good off-ball shooter and he can capably create when he does have the ball. So yeah, I would take Seth Curry there. I believe we're at pick 10. That was Seth Curry.
He's 10th. Yeah. And worth mentioning the reason and Covington, I mean, Seth should have gotten drafted, especially since he had the pedigree with his brother. Covington went undrafted because he went to Tennessee State. This is another imperfect information. People just didn't quite do their homework. But if you go back and look at his stats, again, kind of like CJ, Covington was a great two-way player in his conference and like just had the size, again, the wingspan, the role, to project being very valuable. With Seth, the one thing I'll say about him, as a reason why I would still prefer someone like Hardaway or KCP over him, as someone who is like not a great athlete, because Seth is not a great athlete. Steph is a great athlete and like very strong and like twitchy and explosive. Seth, guys who are a little undersized and not great athletes typically don't become very valuable until they're like mid-20s because their body has to catch up to be able to withstand the pounding in the NBA. So if you take a player like Seth, it means that you're not going to get a lot of value on him when he's on his rookie deal, and that you're basically developing him for another team to reap the rewards, which is what happened to him. Even when he got a chance, I think he was like, he bounced around from team to team. Then he got a little bit of a chance in Sacramento. Then he got a little bit of a chance in Portland. Then he goes to Dallas. Then he goes to Philly. Like that's why he hasn't ever found, I think, a consistent home, is because it took him a while and he never quite matched up to his contract until like right now. Now he's
exceeding the value of his contract, which makes it so that he's a valuable player in a trade, which is why he keeps getting traded. Like he has that Robert Covington, Marcus Smart, the kind of guys that like outplay their contracts, and every team wants to trade for him because of that. And it makes it hard for him to stick in a place. But no, I totally agree. Like it took Seth quite some time to kind of figure out his role in the NBA. But like, funny enough, Seth is one guy that Bill Simmons always brings up, but he's like, we're playing in like, once again, the spacing era, the shooting era, and one of the greatest shooters of all time, maybe if you consider like difficulty of shot and like shot profile, all of that stuff, maybe he's not one of the greatest, but like from a pure percentage standpoint, the greatest shooter or the second greatest shooter, depending on how Joe Harris is shooting that month. Like, and he just is like was an afterthought for like 7 years until he kind of finally figured out a role for him. And he was undervalued going into the draft. He might have been undervalued by the NBA for years. And as you said, it might have taken him a little bit of time to kind of figure things out, and you're developing for the second team, but like he's become a good player in his own right. And the fact that he went undrafted is still kind of insane to me. Like he was a good college player. Like,
and transferred to Duke. Like he ended up being at Duke. So
yeah, so absolutely. It doesn't make any sense to me. But okay, so I believe that was my pick. So you're up now. This is where it gets really hard.
Yeah, number 11. There's still some talent on the board, but it is tough. I will go with I'll go Dennis Schroeder. Schroeder with number 11. So he goes 17. He was another international player. Germany, and had some buzz going into the draft. I mean, he went post lotto because of this international bias, but he has also had like a very funky career because you've seen, depending on his role, him be valuable or him be like actively destructive to his team.
Yes,
and he's sort of like, he's vacillated back and forth between the two. But in terms of, in a redraft, I think some of these guys I've taken already, Hardaway, Oladipo, Porter, I think most context should be good for them. They just got kind of unlucky with the context that they were dealt. With Schroeder, I think the context where he succeeds is like very narrow. But if you get him in that context, then he can play for you in like round 2 or round 3 of a playoff series. And we saw that briefly when he played with Chris Paul in OKC. Because when he's a third guard and he knows that he's a third guard and he doesn't have any delusions of grandeur about being anything better than a third guard, then he can be a defensive hound because he's a very good athlete, really good quick hands, can get over screens on defense. And on offense, he can like take over a quarter and, drop 20 on someone. Now, if you give him more slack than that, then he's going to be inefficient and he's not going to like be a real good distributor of the ball, which is why he's going here and not pick like 6.
Right.
But I do think that there is a world where if he's on a team that can really shoot and where he knows that he's going to be playing off of, 1 or 2 much better guards, then he can have some value. For example, I think if he gets bought out, I wouldn't mind Utah taking a shot on Dennis Schroeder.
Yeah, Utah
I think
would be
that he
good.
could have some value for them like this year. So that he would be my guy.
I know the Sixers try to get him before the deadline. They need that creation off the bench. I don't know if we have enough shooting, but I would not mind him as the third guard on our team. It does not sound like he's going to get bought out, really? Houston and Orlando ruin my life every year with the fucking buyout shit. They're just like, no, we're holding on to these valuable players for some apparent reason. But yeah, so I had Schroeder at 12.
Okay.
So I'm going to take, I might have had him. I actually think in retrospect, I'd probably have him one higher. I'd probably have him where you took him at 11. I think that everything that you said is totally fine. We've seen him have like individual years where it's really good when it's the right role for him is that 6 man. But I'm going to go with Kelly Olynyk with the next pick. So So the thing with Kelly Olynyk is like, I feel like he gets a lot of hate from fans. He tends to bounce around the league, gets a lot of hate because of the thing that he did to Kevin Love in the playoffs a few years ago. The way that he looks, generally speaking, he kind of looks like me. So like, he's going to get hated on by a lot of people. And like that guy's in the NBA. Like, how does that make any sense? But like Kelly Olynyk is just like I can see Kelly Olynyk. He's been on good teams. I could see him like he doesn't blow you away, but he's just like a perfectly fine player. Like there's nothing he does amazing. He's just really solid at a lot of things. And like at this point, I'm picking between him and a bunch of like lower end starting centers, basically. Mm-hmm. So like I'll take Kelly because I like the fact that he can stretch the floor a little bit. He's a decent defender and like makes good decisions with the ball. Like I think he's like a perfectly fine role player. So I'll take Kelly Olynyk.
And he, like you said, he can shoot. And when in doubt, if you can shoot as a big, there is a matchup value to that in the playoffs. If he is, if he's backing up Joel Embiid on the Sixers this year, then when Joel Embiid sits, all of a sudden they have at least an offensive matchup they can exploit for those 10 minutes. And that still has
absolutely
real value. So yeah, I think that's a very good pick.
Speaking of Houston ruining my life, last year, the ongoing joke on Sixers Twitter is if we get Kelly Olynyk in a buyout, we win the finals. So wouldn't go that far, but like perfectly capable, fine backup big, who has contributed to winning and been on winning teams. So all right, so we got 2 more picks left.
Yep.
Who are you going to go with next? Because I think they're the 2 most boring options imaginable.
I don't think so. I would go with Nerlens here. I would take Nerlens.
Okay, I forgot about Nerlens. Okay, all right. So Nerlens isn't super boring, but okay. So
yeah,
what's your pitch on Nerlens?
Nerlens again. The reason that he falls this far is because the production has been so sporadic because he's gotten hurt over and over, and so obviously that is really tough. And if you look at the cards he was dealt. Philadelphia process Sixers, so he was never going to really be long for that team. He has this deal where he gets traded to Dallas, and Dallas offers him a 4-year, $70 million contract that apparently his agent turns down without telling him. Crazy. That agent being Rich Paul, which they're currently in litigation about.
So I actually think that was his agent before Rich Paul. I think he fired his agent because of that.
So maybe I'm mixing it up.
And then he hired Rich Paul, who basically didn't take meetings with the Sixers and the Clippers because he didn't want the argument was that he didn't want him. Basically, Nerlens has been screwed by his agents. Is the long story short here?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, throughout his career, it seems to be a theme. But yeah. No, insane that he would, 470. Like that would have been an amazing situation for him too.
And good, and luckily for him, he's got a 3-year, $30 million deal, which isn't pennies in New York now. But that's also not a great situation for him, like player wise, because the minutes are so inconsistent on that team with all their bigs. But what Nerlens is, and the reason he was thought of so highly, was that he was a very destructive defensive prospect and force. Most bigs can have eye-popping block numbers, or in the case of like Alex Len or Cody Zeller, like not so eye-popping block numbers and still go high. Nerlens had that, but his steal numbers were exceptional, insane for a player of his size. So you can imagine, again, extending it to sort of the Giannis thought, that if let's say his knee, he's still young, he's still not even 30 years old. So if his knee comes around, he gets himself in a playoff setting where he's looking a little stronger, you can put him on really good players, really good NBA players, and he can give them problems. And so that's been my philosophy here, is what sort of translates to the playoffs, what could still happen for these guys. And I still think there's a world, it's not going to be in New York, but there's a world where Nerlens finds a home and he can fulfill a real valuable role playoff-wise for a team. So I would go with Nerlens.
Yeah, I think that's totally fine. I mean, honestly, last year when he was healthy with the Knicks, like they had a top 5 defense largely due to his rim protection. So you have to give him credit. Like when he has been healthy and he's had his opportunities on good teams, middling teams, like he has proven his value on those teams. And once again, like you said, he's 27, 28 now. Like he's still young. Mm-hmm. Like he's not old enough that like you just be like, oh, Nerlens is washed. Like I definitely could see him having, I don't even want to say a career renaissance, but just like value on a good team moving forward. Yep. So last spot, there's basically 3 guys you can pick from here, and they're all the same to me. None of them really like move the needle at all for me, but like you're basically picking between Mason Plumlee, Cody Zeller, and Daniel Tice. So like,
and don't forget Sixers legend Mike Muscala. He's available.
Mike Muscala, like whoever you want, whatever big you want, that's probably not going to help you on your team in the playoffs. Other than Daniel Tice might actually be, of all the guys, because he was undrafted, of all the guys, like, and if we're doing this playoff mindset, he might be the one that I want the most, just because he's proven it already, and because he's like a capable, good backup big, and like I know he had his struggles in Houston, but I'm sure he'll be fine in Boston now that he's there again. So yeah, so I this pick doesn't matter at all to me, but I'll take Daniel Tice there, because like Mason Plumlee and Cody Zeller are perfectly fine rotational centers. I just can't pick a Plumlee or a Zeller in a redraft. I don't think I can take that in my soul.
Yeah, I don't blame you. If it were me, I would say I'd probably go with Reggie Bullock, who went right before
I
Tim
forgot
Hardaway
about Reggie
Jr.
Bullock too.
Yeah, yeah.
All
And
right, we'll take Reggie Bullock and fuck those other guys.
Yeah, much the same idea. A little less off the bounce than what Hardaway has, but you see him in Dallas has a top 10 defense. He plays 35 minutes a night for them now.
Yeah,
so
perfectly fine.
It's
yeah,
same D&3 kind of deal, and
exactly.
will play
All
in
right.
the playoffs for them.
So yeah, and like there are just some other guys that we didn't even mention from this draft that also were like Andre Roberson, who had a few good years, a great perimeter defender with Oklahoma City. Gorgie Dang, who has been a perfectly capable backup center. Like we're getting into like the more boring types of players that like
Ben McLemore's still in the league. He's on the bench on Portland, but you could see him doing similar things for a better team than Portland.
Sure.
So he's still around. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we're really getting into like the dregs past. Like we had to stretch it to get to the end of the lottery for this one. But yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Chuck. I really appreciate your time. It was a great conversation. I went for almost 2 hours. I did not expect that, but I had a blast. And thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much. My podcast is the Chucking Darts NBA and Draft podcast. This was a treat. Thank you so much, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry for not, but I will put everything in the description so you can follow him on Twitter and follow his podcast. So thank you once again. Peace, dude.
All right. Thank you.